The sound of waves crashing against steel, the groan of a ship straining against the ocean's fury, these are the echoes of stories lost to time. But what if I told you that beneath the surface of America's maritime history lies a collection of disasters so strange, so utterly baffling, they seem ripped from the pages of a mystery novel? From ghost ships vanishing without a trace to vessels swallowed whole by freak waves, these aren't just tragedies, they're enigmas that defy every rule of the sea. And today, we're diving deep into 32 of the weirdest, most mind-bending maritime disasters in American history. Picture this: a foggy night in the late 1800s, a steamship packed with passengers suddenly stops dead in the water. No storm, no collision, no explanation, just silence. When rescuers arrive, they find the ship eerily intact, but every single soul on board has vanished. Gone, no note, no struggle, no trace. Or consider the tanker that split in half on a perfectly calm day, its crew watching in horror as the bow simply sailed away without them. These aren't tall tales or sailors' superstitions. These are real events, documented yet unresolved, leaving even the most seasoned experts scratching their heads. What makes these disasters so compelling isn't just the mystery, it's the sheer unpredictability of the sea itself. For centuries, humans have tried to conquer the waves, building bigger, stronger ships, trusting technology to keep us safe. And yet, time and again, the ocean reminds us of its power to humble, to confuse, to terrify. Some of these stories will chill you to the bone. Others will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about the water. But one thing's for certain, by the end of this journey, you'll never look at the sea the same way again. So grab your life jacket, because we're about to set sail into the unknown. The Mary Celeste wasn't just any abandoned ship. It was a floating riddle that sent chills through the bones of every sailor who heard her story. Found drifting near the Azores in December 1872, this sturdy merchant brig was in perfect condition, her sails still set, her cargo of industrial alcohol untouched, even the crew's personal belongings neatly stowed. But the people gone, not a single soul remained. Even stranger, the table in the galley was set for a meal, as if everyone had simply stood up and walked into thin air. Now imagine the scene when the crew of the Dei Gratia spotted her. They'd known the Mary Celeste by reputation, a reliable vessel captained by the experienced Benjamin Briggs, a man who'd brought his wife and young daughter aboard for this voyage. There was no storm that day, no sign of struggle, no leaks or damage to explain why a seasoned captain would order his family and crew into lifeboats without so much as a scribbled note. The ship's single lifeboat was missing, but why abandon a perfectly seaworthy vessel? And where did they go? The ocean gave no answers. Theories exploded like waves against a cliff. Some whispered of mutiny, but there was no evidence of violence. Others blamed pirates, yet the valuable cargo sat undisturbed. Then came the wilder ideas: sea monsters, alien abductions, even a curse. The truth: investigations pointed to a possible explosion caused by alcohol fumes, prompting a panicked evacuation. But if that were the case, why didn't the crew return when the danger passed? No one knows. The Mary Celeste became the ghost ship that defined maritime mystery, a story so haunting it inspired conspiracy theories for centuries. And to this day, the Atlantic keeps her secrets. The Mary Celeste's logbook, recovered from that eerily empty ship, only deepened the mystery. The last entry was mundane routine coordinates and weather notes, nothing suggesting panic or danger. But modern forensic teams examining those fading pages noticed something odd: the ink. Certain entries appeared slightly smudged, as if written in haste or under stress. And then there was the timing. The final log was dated 9 days before the ship was found, leaving a gap no one could explain. Had the crew abandoned ship immediately after that last entry? Or had they stayed aboard for days, quietly living as if nothing was wrong, before vanishing without a trace? One persistent myth claims an alcohol explosion forced everyone overboard. Here's why that doesn't hold water. The cargo, 1,900 barrels of industrial alcohol, was still sealed when inspectors boarded. No fumes, no residue, no scorch marks. Even the ship's cat, usually the first to flee chaos, was found curled up asleep. And if fumes had triggered an evacuation, why would seasoned sailors leave behind every compass, sextant, and navigation tool? In 1872, abandoning ship without these was tantamount to suicide. Recent sonar scans of the seabed near where the Mary Celeste drifted revealed something chilling: faint, scattered markings that could be the remains of her lifeboat. But if the crew had launched it, why were no bodies ever found? No shred of clothing, no floating debris. The Atlantic isn't known for swallowing evidence so completely. Some researchers now speculate the crew might have fallen victim to a rare maritime phenomenon, a waterspout, or even a sudden methane bubble rising from the ocean floor, capable of knocking people unconscious or capsizing a small boat in seconds. But without physical proof, these remain ghost stories dressed in science. Perhaps the most haunting detail of all, the ship's name itself. Originally christened the Amazon, she'd been renamed after a series of misfortunes, a collision, a captain's sudden death, leading sailors to whisper she was cursed. Coincidence, maybe, but when the Mary Celeste was finally scuttled years later, her last owner deliberately ran her aground in a failed insurance fraud scheme. Even in death, she refused to go quietly. Centuries later, those tattered logs and sonar echoes still whisper the same question: what really happened out there on the empty sea? The SS Waratah wasn't just a ship, it was a floating omen. When this steel-hulled luxury liner vanished off the coast of South Africa in July 1909, it left behind not just wreckage, but a trail of eerie warnings that still sends shivers down spines. Built to carry passengers between Europe and Australia, the Waratah was branded unsinkable, a claim the ocean would violently dispute. But what makes this disappearance truly chilling isn't just the lack of debris or distress calls, it's the fact that multiple passengers saw it coming. Days before the ship's final voyage, a first-class traveler named Claude Sawyer awoke from a nightmare so vivid he abandoned the trip entirely. In his dream, a blood-soaked figure in medieval armor pointed at the Waratah and whispered one word: danger. Sawyer wasn't alone. Other passengers reported unease, whispering about the ship's odd list to one side, how it rolled unnaturally even in calm seas. One musician even penned a farewell letter to his family before boarding, writing, "If I don't survive this voyage, remember I loved you." Then came the final sightings. Off South Africa's wild coast, another ship, the Harlow, spotted the Waratah battling monstrous swells. Through a brief break in the storm, the captain noted her lights burning bright, then nothing. By morning, she'd disappeared without even a garbled SOS. Search crews scoured 20,000 square miles, finding not so much as a life preserver. No oil slick, no floating chairs, no bodies, just silence. Modern expeditions equipped with sonar and deep-sea drones have turned up empty too, the leading theory. A rogue wave, a wall of water taller than a 10-story building, might have rolled the Waratah instantly, trapping hundreds inside as she plunged straight to the seabed. But that doesn't explain the premonitions, the dreams, the chilling certainty so many felt that this ship was cursed. To this day, the Waratah remains one of the ocean's most stubborn ghosts, a vessel that didn't just vanish, it erased itself. And the Atlantic, it keeps its secrets locked tight. The legend of the Flying Dutchman, that spectral ship doomed to sail the seas forever, haunts maritime folklore like no other. But what if the Waratah didn't just vanish? What if, like the Dutchman, it never truly left? Sailors have whispered for centuries about ghost ships materializing in the mist, their crews long dead yet still trapped aboard. The Waratah's disappearance fits eerily well into this tradition. Just 2 years after it vanished, a tramp steamer off the Cape of Good Hope reported spotting a sleek, unidentified liner matching the Waratah's description, glowing faintly against the night sky before dissolving into the fog. The crew swore it wasn't a mirage. Compare this to the Joyita, another vanished ship found drifting in the South Pacific in 1955. Like the Waratah, it was abandoned without explanation, meals half-eaten, engines still running. But here's the twist: the Joyita reappeared, the Waratah never did. That's what makes it the perfect candidate for phantom ship lore. Most ghost stories need a body. The Waratah gave us nothing, no wreckage, no final resting place, just a gaping hole in history where a ship should be. Even skeptics admit the parallels are unsettling. The Dutchman's myth began with a reckless captain defying a storm, cursing his crew to an eternity at sea. The Waratah's own captain, Josiah Ilbery, was a seasoned mariner, but passengers noted his unshakable calm even as the ship listed ominously. Was that confidence or something darker? Modern parapsychologists point to stone tape theory, the idea that traumatic events imprint on their surroundings. If any ship earned that echo, it's the Waratah. Then there's the Orang Medan, a Dutch freighter whose entire crew was found dead in 1947, faces frozen in terror, no signs of injury. Radio operators caught one final garbled message: all officers dead, possibly whole crew, before the line went dead. Like the Waratah, it's a story that defies logic. Natural explanations, toxic gas, piracy, fall short. Sometimes the sea doesn't just kill, it claims. Perhaps the most chilling detail: in 1952, a British vessel near the Waratah's last known position picked up faint, distorted voices on their radio. One phrase cut through the static: "She's coming back." When the crew scanned the horizon, the water was empty. Coincidence? Maybe. But in the vast, indifferent ocean where reality blurs with legend, the Waratah's greatest mystery isn't how it disappeared, it's whether it ever really did. The Eastland wasn't just a ship, it was a disaster waiting to happen, and the truly horrifying part, it never even left the dock. On July 24, 1915, this steamship was packed with over 2,500 excited factory workers and their families, all set for a company picnic across Lake Michigan. But as the crowd laughed and boarded, the Eastland began to tilt slightly. No one panicked until the tilt became a lurch, and within minutes, the entire ship rolled onto its side, still tied to the wharf. Water rushed into open portholes, trapping hundreds below decks. 844 people drowned in the Chicago River that day, most of them women and children, their picnic lunches still packed. This wasn't just bad luck, it was a cascade of negligence. After the Titanic's sinking 3 years earlier, new laws required ships to carry enough lifeboats for everyone. But the Eastland, already dangerously top-heavy, had those extra lifeboats bolted to its upper decks like an afterthought. The added weight made the ship unstable, a flaw engineers had warned about for years. Even worse, the crew had ignored basic safety drills, and the river was so shallow that when the Eastland capsized, its hull stuck out of the water. Survivors clung to the exposed side, watching helplessly as others were crushed under furniture or trapped in air pockets screaming for help. The aftermath was just as shocking. While the Titanic's tragedy sparked global outrage, the Eastland's victims were largely forgotten working-class immigrants whose deaths barely made headlines. The ship's owners blamed the crew blamed the designers, and the courts, they let everyone off the hook. The Eastland itself was salvaged, renamed, and even served in World War II, a grim punchline to an avoidable tragedy. Today, a single plaque near the disaster site marks the deadliest shipwreck in Great Lakes history, a catastrophe that wasn't an act of God but of human arrogance. And the cruelest twist, the lifeboats meant to save lives never even touched the water. The Eastland disaster should have been a wake-up call, a brutal lesson in accountability. Instead, it became a textbook case of corporate evasion. Within hours of the capsizing, the ship's owners, the St. Joseph Chicago Steamship Company, launched a calculated campaign to shift blame. They pointed fingers at the engineers, the crew, even the passengers themselves, claiming they'd rushed to one side like some panicked herd. Never mind that the ship had a history of instability, or that inspectors had flagged its dangerous tilt as far back as 1903. The company's lawyers swooped in like vultures, burying documents and bribing witnesses to disappear. Sound familiar? It's the same playbook used by Big Tobacco, by Purdue Pharma, by Boeing after the 737 MAX crashes: delay, deny, deflect. The official inquiry was a farce. Key witnesses like the engineer who'd begged to reduce the Eastland's passenger capacity were never called to testify. The jury, stacked with the shipping industry's allies, took just minutes to clear everyone of wrongdoing. No fines, no reforms, not even a public apology. Meanwhile, grieving families were offered pittances, some as low as $50 per life lost if they promised not to sue, the most damning evidence. The ship's own logbooks, which vanished mysteriously before investigators could examine them. Fast forward to modern disasters and the parallels are chilling. Take the Deepwater Horizon oil spill in 2010. Like the Eastland, BP had ignored warnings about faulty equipment. Like the Eastland, they blamed worker error while shredding internal memos that predicted catastrophe. Or consider the Grenfell Tower fire in 2017, where flammable cladding approved by officials with industry ties turned a London apartment block into a death trap. The script never changes: profits over people, paper trails erased, survivors left screaming into the void. What makes the Eastland unique isn't just the scale of the cover-up, it's how brazen it was. While the Titanic's sinking spurred sweeping safety reforms, the Eastland's victims were swept under the rug because they were poor immigrant laborers. Their tragedy didn't fit the narrative of heroic maritime disasters. Even the ship itself got a second life, repurposed as a naval training vessel ironically named the Wilmette. The message was clear: corporations could literally right their mistakes while the dead stayed buried. Today, a single weathered plaque near the Chicago River marks the disaster site. No museum, no Hollywood films, just 844 names fading into history. But the Eastland's real legacy isn't in stone. It's in every corporate boardroom where someone still weighs lives against liability. Because when the stakes are high and the cameras are off, some companies still ask the same question: can we get away with it? The Eastland proved horrifyingly that sometimes they can. The SS Morro castle wasn't just burning, it was being consumed alive, and the nightmare began before the first flame even flickered. On September 7, 1934, this luxury cruise liner was gliding back to New York from Havana, packed with wealthy vacationers still buzzing from Cuban jazz and rum cocktails. Then at 2:15 in the morning, smoke began curling from a storage locker. Within minutes, fire engulfed the ship like a matchstick tossed into gasoline. 137 people would die that night, but the real horror wasn't just the blaze. It was the chain of events that turned a disaster into something far more sinister. It started with the captain. Just hours before the fire erupted, 52-year-old Robert Wilmot locked himself in his cabin after complaining of stomach pain. When crew members checked on him, they found him dead, his face twisted in agony. The ship's doctor ruled it a heart attack, but whispers spread fast. Wilmot had been acting strangely for days, paranoid, even refusing to eat meals he didn't prepare himself. Was it natural causes or something more? The timing couldn't have been worse. His replacement, Chief Officer William Worms, was suddenly thrust into command. A man with no experience handling a crisis of this scale. Chaos erupted as the fire spread. The Morro Castle's state-of-the-art fire suppression system, useless, crew members untrained and panicking, sprayed weak streams of water as passengers scrambled through smoke-filled hallways. Then came the ultimate betrayal: lifeboats, Dozens were lowered half empty or not at all, as crewmen abandoned ship, leaving women and children to fend for themselves. One radio operator, George Alagna, stayed at his post screaming SOS calls into the night while flames licked at his back. His transmissions were so desperate, so raw, that Coast Guard operators later said they could hear the fire in his voice. By dawn, the Morro Castle was a charred carcass, beached near Asbury Park, New Jersey, so close to shore that tourists would later picnic on the sand beside its smoldering hull. The investigations were explosive. The ship's fire doors left open, the flammable wood paneling, a known hazard, the crew's cowardice undeniable, but the captain's death remained the darkest mystery. No autopsy was performed, and Wilmot's body was buried in a sealed casket. Some speculated poison, others whispered sabotage. Wilmot had recently fired several crew members for gambling and smuggling. The most chilling theory, arson. A crewman named George Rogers, a known pyromaniac with a criminal past, would later be convicted of murdering his neighbor in a strikingly similar fire. Was he the monster behind the Morro Castle's hell? The truth died with the ashes. What's certain is this: the disaster wasn't just an accident. It was a perfect storm of human failure from the top down. And when the flames finally died, they left behind more than wreckage. They left a question that still burns. How many of those lives could have been saved? George Rogers wasn't just the Morro Castle's radio operator. He was a walking paradox. The man hailed as a hero for staying at his post during the Inferno would later be convicted of murder, his fingerprints all over another suspicious fire. So was Rogers a savior or a saboteur? The evidence cuts both ways like a ship's prow through dark water. Start with the fire's origins. Official reports blamed an electrical short in a storage locker, but the timing reeks of foul play. The blaze erupted just hours after Captain Wilmot's sudden death, spreading with unnatural speed through multiple decks simultaneously. Fire experts later noted the flames behaved like accelerated by an accelerant. No surprise, since Rogers had a documented obsession with fires since childhood. As a teen, he'd been arrested for torching a neighbor's shed just to watch it burn. Yet aboard the Morro Castle, he calmly transmitted distress signals while smoke choked the radio room, even refusing relief when crew members begged him to abandon ship. Heroic dedication or a front to cover his tracks. Then there's the radio itself. Survivors reported hearing strange interference in the hours before the fire, like someone tampering with equipment. Rogers, as the ship's sole operator, had unrestricted access. Even more damning, his later crimes. In 1953, Rogers murdered his elderly neighbor by wiring her furnace to explode, a chilling echo of the electrical fault blamed for the Morro Castle. When police searched his home, they found detailed notes on arson techniques and newspaper clippings about the ship's disaster. Coincidence? The jury didn't think so. But the electrical theory holds weight too. The Morro Castle was a floating tinderbox, its wiring notoriously faulty. Passengers had complained of sparking outlets for weeks, and the ship's owners had ignored warnings from engineers. Worse, the fire doors meant to contain blazes were left open that night, turning passageways into chimneys. Natural decay and corporate negligence could explain everything except Rogers' grinning confession to a cellmate years later. "They never proved it was me," he allegedly bragged, "but I watched that ship burn like a Christmas tree." The truth may lie somewhere in the gray mist between malice and misfortune. Perhaps Rogers didn't start the fire, but he sure didn't try to stop it. His heroics bought him time, respect, and a perfect alibi. Meanwhile, the Morro Castle's wreck became a macabre tourist attraction, its carcass picked clean by souvenir hunters. One visitor even stole the ship's bell, an eerie metaphor for how quickly tragedy fades into spectacle. Whether by spark or by spite, one thing's certain: the ocean wasn't the only thing that failed those passengers that night. It was the people they trusted to keep them safe. The SS Milwaukee was built to conquer Lake Michigan's brutal winters, an ice-breaking car ferry designed to haul entire trains across the water. But on that October night in 1929, it wasn't ice that doomed her. It was something far more insidious: complacency. The ship had just left port in Milwaukee, her hull packed with 27 railroad cars, when the first distress call crackled over the radio. "We have a bad list," Chief Officer Robert Cripe reported, his voice calm but edged with urgency. Freight sliding to port side. Minutes later, the radio went silent. When dawn broke, the Milwaukee had vanished, taking 52 men with her. No wreckage, no lifeboats, just an oil slick spreading over the water like a funeral shroud. What makes this disaster so chilling isn't just the suddenness. It's the trail of ignored warnings. The Milwaukee's freight doors, designed to seal tight against waves, had been left slightly ajar for ventilation, a common practice cruise called sniffing the breeze. But that night, with storm winds hammering the ship, those inches of space became a death sentence. As water seeped in, the railroad cars, each weighing tons, broke loose and slid like dominoes, tilting the ship past recovery. Salvage crews later found one door bent outward, its hinges twisted like tinfoil, proof of the force that had flooded her in minutes. Then there's the radio transcript. The final messages weren't panicked, they were eerily routine, as if no one grasped the gravity until it was too late. Listing bad but manageable, Cripe had said words that now read like grim irony. Maritime experts later reenacted the sinking using scale models, proving the Milwaukee could have survived the storm if not for those unsecured cars. It was a textbook case of normalization of deviance, where cutting corners becomes habit until catastrophe strikes. The wreck wouldn't be found until 70 years later, resting upright on the lakebed as if paused mid-plunge. Sonar images showed the freight cars still inside, some stacked like toys tossed by a giant. But the real horror, the lifeboats were intact, still tethered to the deck. The crew never had time to launch them. Today, the Milwaukee's demise is studied in naval schools not as a freak accident, but as a lesson in how small choices, like leaving a door cracked, can cascade into unthinkable tragedy. The lake doesn't forgive shortcuts, it collects them. The USS Cyclops didn't just vanish, it evaporated from existence, leaving behind one of the most haunting gaps in maritime history. When this massive Navy collier set sail from Barbados in March 1918, bound for Baltimore with 309 crew and passengers aboard, she was carrying more than just coal. She was carrying secrets, some buried in her cargo holds, others locked in the mind of her increasingly unstable captain. The last radio transmission from the ship was chillingly mundane, weather reports, nothing more. Then silence, no distress call, no wreckage, no bodies, just an empty ocean where a 530-foot steel giant should have been. At the heart of this mystery stands Captain George Worley, a man whose behavior in the days before the disappearance borders on deranged. Witnesses reported him pacing the deck at all hours, muttering to himself, even accusing his crew of plotting against him. Some claimed he'd changed course abruptly for no reason, zigzagging through calm seas like a man fleeing ghosts. Others whispered about the cargo, not just coal, but 10,000 tons of manganese ore, a volatile substance known to destabilize ships if improperly stored. Was Worley's paranoia justified, or was he unraveling under the weight of his own decisions? Then there's the Bermuda Triangle angle. The Cyclops disappeared in what's now the dead center of that infamous zone, fueling decades of speculation. But here's what conspiracy theorists overlook. The ship's route that final day took it directly through an area teeming with German U-boats. 1918 was the height of World War I, and unrestricted submarine warfare turned the Atlantic into a hunting ground. Yet no U-boat captain ever claimed the Cyclops as a kill, and no oil slicks or debris matched the telltale signs of a torpedo strike. The Navy's investigation only deepened the intrigue. The ship's logs lost, key witnesses untraceable. Even the manganese ore theory falls apart under scrutiny. Modern simulations show it would have taken weeks for shifting cargo to capsize a ship that size, not hours. The most plausible explanation, a catastrophic structural failure. The Cyclops had a history of hull cracks, and her design, top-heavy with massive coal bins, made her prone to sudden listing. Combine that with Worley's erratic navigation, and you have a recipe for disaster. But plausibility doesn't satisfy the human need for answers. Families of the lost demanded closure, and the Navy, desperate for any lead, even consulted psychics. One medium claimed to see the ship dragged downward by glowing hands, while another insisted Worley had steered them into a hole in the sea. Wild as these sound, they reflect a deeper truth. Some disappearances defy logic. The Cyclops didn't just sink, it stepped off the edge of the known world, taking its secrets with it. And in that vast, uncharted silence, the Bermuda Triangle found its most enduring ghost. Imagine standing on the deck of the USS Cyclops as she lists violently to one side, not slowly, like a ship taking on water, but suddenly, as if an invisible hand just yanked the floor from beneath your feet. That's the terrifying scenario manganese ore theorists paint when explaining the ship's disappearance. This wasn't ordinary cargo, it was a ticking time bomb disguised as raw material. Manganese, dense and prone to shifting, could turn from solid to liquid like in rough seas, sliding en masse to one side of the hull. Modern simulations show the horrifying physics at play. Just a 15-degree tilt could send 10,000 tons of ore surging like a metallic avalanche, capsizing a ship the size of the Cyclops in under 60 seconds. But here's where the theory gets even darker. The Navy's loading logs, recovered years later, revealed the ore hadn't been properly stabilized. Instead of being evenly distributed in smaller holds, it was dumped into two massive compartments, a cost-cutting move that turned the ship into a pendulum waiting to swing. CGI reconstructions depict the nightmare in chilling detail. Waves rock the vessel just enough to loosen the manganese's grip, then boom, the entire load lurches left, dragging the Cyclops into an irrecoverable roll. By the time the crew realized what was happening, the portholes were already underwater, the radio room submerged before a single SOS could be sent. Yet skeptics counter with a glaring hole in this explanation. Manganese shifts gradually, not instantaneously. Even improperly stored, it would have given the crew minutes, maybe hours, to react, not seconds, unless that is another factor amplified the danger. Some researchers point to the Cyclops' coal bunkers, half empty after the long voyage. Combined with the ore's weight, this could have raised the ship's center of gravity to catastrophic levels. Picture a toddler wearing a lead helmet, one stumble and they're going down hard. The Cyclops, top-heavy and overburdened, may have met the same fate. The most haunting detail, recent sonar scans of the seabed near the Cyclops' last known position show unusual, jagged grooves, as if something massive scraped along the ocean floor before vanishing into the abyss. Could these be the death throes of a ship dragged under by its own cargo? We may never know for sure, but one thing's certain, whether by human error, unstable cargo, or something far stranger, the Cyclops didn't just sink. It was swallowed whole, and the Atlantic, as always, keeps its secrets. The SS Edmund Fitzgerald didn't just sink, it was erased by Lake Superior in a matter of minutes, leaving behind nothing but a haunting chorus of unanswered questions. When the freighter vanished beneath the waves on November 10, 1975, it took 29 men down with it, their final moments lost to one of the most ferocious storms ever recorded on the Great Lakes. Dubbed the November Witch, this wasn't just bad weather, it was a meteorological monster with hurricane-force winds and waves topping 35 feet, tall enough to swallow a 10-story building. But what truly chills the bones isn't the storm's fury, it's how fast the Fitz, a ship nearly the length of 2 football fields, disappeared without a single mayday call. Gordon Lightfoot's iconic ballad, The Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald, immortalized the disaster, but it also cemented myths. The song claims the crew knew their fate, singing, Does anyone know where the love of God goes when the waves turn the minutes to hours? Poignant but pure fiction, the ship's final radio transmission was shockingly mundane. "We're holding our own." Then silence, no dramatic last words, no hymns, just static. Investigators later determined the Fitz likely plunged so fast the crew never had time to react. 1 minute they were battling the storm, the next the lake floor was rushing up to meet them. Then there's the missing hatch covers theory Lightfoot popularized. The song suggests rogue waves tore open the cargo holds, flooding the ship, but underwater footage tells a different story. When a robotic submersible found the wreck in 1976, the covers were intact. The real culprit, a fatal combination of design flaws and freak waves. The Fitz had no watertight midship section, a cost-cutting measure that let the Great Lakes' most infamous storm exploit every weakness. As the ship plunged down an underwater trough, a monstrous wave likely slammed into its deck, bending the hull like a soda can before the next surge finished the job. Modern simulations reveal an even darker twist. The Fitz might have split in half before sinking. Sonar scans show the stern section twisted nearly 180 degrees from the bow, as if the ship snapped like a twig. Some researchers argue the cargo, 26,000 tons of taconite pellets, shifted suddenly, overloading the hull. Others point to the storm's unique Three Sisters phenomenon, where waves cluster in deadly trios, each amplifying the next. Whatever the trigger, the result was the same. A ship that had weathered countless storms met its match in a lake that shows no mercy. The wreck itself is now a protected gravesite, but the real memorial lives in the whispers of sailors who still cross Superior. They talk of hearing ghostly foghorns on stormy nights or spotting a shadowy freighter where none should be. The Fitz didn't just leave behind a wreck, it left a legend. And in that icy darkness 230 feet down, 29 souls stand as a reminder. The lake never gives up its dead, not even when the world demands answers. The wreckage of the Edmund Fitzgerald didn't just settle on Lake Superior's floor, it shattered, revealing secrets that rewrite the disaster's narrative. When a robotic submersible first illuminated the wreck in 1976, the footage stunned investigators. The ship wasn't merely broken, it was cleaved in two. The stern section spun like a top and deposited hundreds of feet from the bow. This wasn't the gradual flooding of a storm-battered vessel. This was catastrophic structural failure, a snap so violent it left no time for distress calls. Modern meteorology data paints the scene with chilling precision. The Three Sisters rogue wave theory, long romanticized by sailors, turns out to be a red herring. Weather buoys from that night recorded waves topping 35 feet, but none clustered in the mythical trio pattern. Instead, sonar scans of the wreck tell a different story. The Fitz's midsection crumpled inward as if punched by a giant. Naval engineers now believe the ship hit a phenomenon called hogging, where the bow and stern are suspended on wave crests while the unsupported center buckles under its own weight. Combine that with the Fitz's aging hull riddled with stress fractures from years of heavy loads, and you have a recipe for instant disintegration. Dive footage reveals even darker clues. The cargo holds, once thought to have flooded through open hatches, were found sealed tight, but the taconite pellets inside, they'd shifted violently, scattering like marbles across the lakebed. This suggests the ship didn't just break, it imploded from within, the cargo's momentum tearing the hull apart as it capsized. And here's the twist, the Fitz's design, hailed as state-of-the-art in the 1950s, lacked critical reinforcements that later ships adopted. Its watertight bulkhead stopped short of the upper decks, creating a fatal weak point where Superior's fury could pry it open like a tin can. The most haunting detail lies in the debris field. Personal effects, a life jacket, a coffee mug were found neatly placed as if the ship had simply tipped its contents into the depths. No struggle, no panic. Just silence. This aligns with survivor accounts from similar wrecks, where crews described the eerie sensation of the world tilting before everything went black. The Fitz didn't just sink, it unzipped itself in a matter of seconds, leaving 29 men no chance to fight back. So why does the rogue wave myth persist? Because it offers a villain, a single cinematic force to blame. The truth, a cocktail of design flaws, metal fatigue, and bad luck, feels too mundane for such a legendary wreck. But Lake Superior doesn't deal in legends. It deals in cold, hard physics, and the Fitz's shattered hull is its most brutally honest epitaph. The General Slocum should have been a floating celebration. A sunny June day in 1904, 1,500 German immigrants packed onto this gleaming paddle steamer for a church picnic up the East River. But within minutes of departure, the party turned to hell. A fire sparked in the forward storage room, likely from a tossed cigarette or faulty wiring, and with the wooden decks soaked in decades of flammable paint, the flames spread like a living thing. Panic erupted as families realized the life jackets, thousands of them, hanging neatly along the rails, were rotten relics stuffed with disintegrated cork dust. When desperate passengers strapped them on and leapt into the water, the life preservers dragged them straight to the bottom like stones. At the heart of this catastrophe stood Captain William Van Schaik, a man whose failures bordered on criminal. Instead of steering the burning ship toward nearby docks just 300 feet away, he pushed full speed ahead into headwinds, fanning the flames into an inferno. Witnesses later described him abandoning the wheel entirely, climbing into a lifeboat while women burned alive in their long, flammable skirts, the Slocum's fire hoses. Rotted through, bursting like wet paper when crew tried to use them. The crew itself, never trained in fire drills, some reportedly laughing as they tossed useless buckets of water at the blaze. The aftermath was even more grotesque. Bodies washed ashore for days, many clustered in the kill zone, where the captain had finally run the ship aground a shallow grave at North Brother Island. Funeral processions filled Manhattan's German enclave, Kleindeutschland, for weeks. Yet Van Schaik, the only person convicted, served a mere 4 years before a presidential pardon. The real villains, the ship inspectors who'd rubber-stamped its decay, the owners who'd ignored warnings, walked free. The Slocum's wreck was quietly scrapped, its legacy buried until 9/11 surpassed it as New York's deadliest disaster. But the lesson remains: neglect isn't just careless, it's combustible. The General Slocum's flames didn't just consume lives, they incinerated an entire community's future. New York's Kleindeutschland, once a bustling enclave of German immigrants, never recovered from that June afternoon. Over 1,000 families lost mothers, children, grandparents, entire branches of family trees reduced to ash in the East River. The neighborhood's churches, which had organized the doomed picnic, stood half empty at subsequent services, their pews filled with ghosts. Within 5 years, what had been America's largest German-speaking community began scattering like dandelion seeds in the wind, the grief too heavy to bear in streets where every corner held memories of the dead. This wasn't just demographic change, it was cultural erasure. German-language newspapers folded as readership dwindled. Beer gardens that had echoed with Oompa music fell silent. Even the tradition of church outings, once the glue binding the community, became taboo, too painful a reminder of the Slocum's charred wreck. Survivors who stayed faced cruel whispers, "Why didn't you burn with them?" Others were shunned outright, their survival somehow seen as betrayal. The psychological toll manifested in haunting ways. One distraught father converted his apartment into a shrine for his lost children, leaving their untouched clothes laid out each morning until his own death decades later. The exodus reshaped Manhattan itself. As Germans fled north to the Bronx or west to Midtown, Jewish and Italian immigrants filled the vacuum in the Lower East Side. Tenements that had resonated with German lullabies now smelled of simmering tomato sauce and brisket slow-cooked for Shabbat. The Slocum disaster became the unspoken divide in neighborhood histories, stories told in hushed tones by those who remained, or buried entirely by newcomers unaware of the street's traumatic past. Most heartbreaking, the institutional forgetting. While the Titanic's victims were memorialized worldwide, the Slocum dead, largely working-class immigrants, received only a modest fountain in Tompkins Square Park, its inscription quickly weathered to near illegibility. Even today, few New Yorkers know that the disaster effectively ended Kleindeutschland's golden age, dispersing a vibrant culture that had once given the city its first Christmas trees, its first kindergartens, its very concept of lager beer. The fire didn't just kill people, it killed a piece of the city's soul, leaving scars still faintly visible if you know where to look. The SS Sultana should have been a symbol of hope, a steamboat carrying Union soldiers home after the nightmare of Civil War prisons. Instead, it became a floating coffin, its decks crammed with 2,300 paroled prisoners, all desperate to see their families again. That number alone should have been a death sentence. The Sultana was built to hold just 376 passengers, but greed, not gravity, sealed its fate. On April 27, 1865, just days after Lincoln's assassination, the Sultana's overworked boilers exploded near Memphis, ripping the ship apart like a firework. The blast hurled men into the icy Mississippi, where strong currents and debris turned the water into a meat grinder. Survivors described a scene from hell: burning timbers crushing swimmers, men clinging to floating corpses, horses thrashing in panic as the current dragged them under. The official death toll topped 1,800, more than the Titanic, yet few today even know its name. Why? Because tragedy has a pecking order. Lincoln's murder dominated headlines, leaving the Sultana's victims to die twice, first in the river, then in obscurity. But dig deeper, and this wasn't just bad timing. It was corruption with a body count. The Sultana's captain, J. Cass Mason, had bribed army officers to pack his ship beyond madness, earning $5 per enlisted man, 10 per officer, a small fortune. Inspectors noted the bulging decks but looked the other way. One even joked the boat was so overloaded it might sink before leaving port. The cracked boiler. Patched days earlier with shoddy metal, the firemen, so exhausted from shoveling coal to power the overburdened ship, they collapsed at their posts. The river itself conspired against them. Spring floods had swollen the Mississippi to record widths, creating currents that swept away whole families clinging to wreckage. Rescue boats arrived too late, their crews stunned by the scale of carnage. One witness described a carpet of blue uniforms stretching for miles downstream. Yet when the War Department investigated, blame fell on convenient scapegoats, not the officers who took bribes, not the inspectors who ignored violations. Today, a single plaque marks the disaster in Marion, Arkansas. No Hollywood films, no best-selling books, just a whisper of steam rising from history's cracks, reminding us that sometimes the deadliest disasters aren't accidents at all. Their choices weighted with greed, sealed with indifference, and paid for in lives. The Princendom should have been doomed the moment flames erupted in her engine room, a Dutch luxury liner stranded in the freezing Alaskan wilderness, hundreds of miles from the nearest port. But what happened next wasn't a tragedy. It was a miracle with a darkly comic twist, a disaster averted by heroism only to be nearly undone by sheer absurdity. October 4, 1980, the ship was cruising through Glacier Bay when smoke began billowing from below decks. Within minutes, the fire spread uncontrollably, forcing the captain to issue an abandon ship order. Picture the scene: elderly passengers, many in bathrobes and slippers, clambering into lifeboats as the Arctic wind bit through their pajamas. The water temperature hovered just above freezing, giving survivors mere minutes before hypothermia set in. But here's where the story takes a bizarre turn. Unlike the chaotic panics of maritime lore, the Princendom's evacuation was eerily calm. Crew members handed out blankets and hot chocolate as if this were a slightly inconvenient shore excursion. One passenger later recalled a violinist serenading the lifeboats from the burning deck, playing "Nearer, My God, to Thee," the same hymn played on the Titanic until the flames forced him to jump. Then came the rescue, and with it, a series of near catastrophes that bordered on slapstick. The US Coast Guard and nearby tankers scrambled to the scene, but coordination was lacking. One lifeboat drifted directly into the path of the rescue ship Williamsburg, its passengers screaming as the massive hull loomed over them. A crewman later admitted, "We almost saved them by running them over." Another group was hoisted aboard a tanker via cargo net, only for the net to snap, dropping them onto the deck in a tangle of limbs and life jackets. And the fire, it burned so fiercely that the Prinsendom's own lifeboats, still attached to the sinking ship, ignited like floating bonfires. The aftermath was no less surreal. All 233 passengers and crew survived, making it one of history's most successful evacuations, but the Prinsendam herself refused to die gracefully. As she sank, the burning hull drifted into shallow water and got stuck, forcing the Coast Guard to tow her out to deeper seas like dragging a stubborn dog away from the dinner table. Even then, she left a final insult, an oil spill that cost millions to clean up. The lesson: sometimes the sea doesn't just want to kill you, it wants to humiliate you first. What makes this ordeal unique isn't the disaster, it's the dizzying whiplash between triumph and farce. For every heroic pilot who braved freezing winds to airlift survivors, there was a rescue vessel accidentally threatening to flatten lifeboats. For every flawless lifeboat launch, there was a passenger slipping on a stray banana peel during evacuation. Yes, really. The Prinsendam proved that even when humanity wins against the ocean, it's often by the skin of our teeth and with a few bruises to our dignity. Modern cruise ships now cite the Prinsendam as a case study in evacuation preparedness, but they tend to gloss over the chaotic aftermath, focusing instead on the flawless initial response. Because who wants to admit that even our greatest victories against the sea are messy, ridiculous, and sometimes downright embarrassing? The Prinsendam's passengers survived the Arctic. But they also survived something almost as rare, a disaster where the biggest threat wasn't the ocean's wrath, but humanity's talent for turning triumph into a Three Stooges routine. The Marine Electric wasn't supposed to be seaworthy, it was a floating relic, a World War II-era rust bucket held together by paint and prayer, hauling coal up the eastern seaboard in the brutal winter of 1983. When the first storm waves slammed into the ship's buckling hull on February 12th, crewmen reported hearing a sound like thunder as seawater gushed through gaping holes in the deck, holes inspectors had somehow overlooked. What followed wasn't just a sinking, it was a slow-motion execution by hypothermia, a nightmare that exposed the rot at the heart of maritime safety and forced America to finally confront its aging fleet of death traps. Bob Cusick, the ship's chief mate, would later describe the sinking in bone-chilling detail. As the Marine Electric listed violently, men scrambled onto life rafts only to find them frozen solid, their survival gear encased in ice. Winds howled at 60 knots, hurling waves so high they flipped rafts like toys, dumping survivors into 34-degree water. One lifeboat, half submerged, became a gruesome game of musical chairs as men took turns standing in the waist-deep slush, knowing prolonged exposure would stop their hearts. Cusick watched crewmates slip into delirium, peeling off their own clothes in the throes of paradoxical undressing, a hypothermic death spiral where victims, confused and freezing, actually feel like they're burning alive. The Coast Guard's rescue attempts read like a cruel joke. Helicopters arrived hours late, their rotors battling winds so fierce one pilot compared it to flying through a car wash. When a chopper finally lowered a basket to Cusick's raft, the cable snapped, nearly braining him with the steel hook. Only 3 men survived the night. 31 others perished, their bodies later recovered with fingers worn to the bone from clawing at the raft's frozen fabric. But the real scandal emerged in dry dock. The Marine Electric's hull was a Swiss cheese of corroded steel, patched with makeshift welds that inspectors had rubber stamped as sound. investigators discovered the ship's owners, like so many in the industry, had exploited lax regulations to keep ancient vessels operating long past their expiration dates. The victims didn't die because of the storm. They died because profit trumped safety at every turn. The outcry changed history. Within a year, Congress passed sweeping reforms requiring mandatory retirement ages for ships, stricter hull inspections, and modern survival suits regulations that still save lives today. But for the families of the 31, it was cold comfort. The Marine Electric didn't just sink that night. It dragged an entire industry's dirty secrets into the light, proving sometimes progress only comes after tragedy holds up a mirror. The fog was so thick that night it felt like the ocean itself had vanished, swallowing the SS Andrea Doria and the MS Stockholm into a ghostly void where radar beams became their only eyes. Two ships, one gliding west from Italy with its wealthy passengers sipping aperitifs, the other charging east from Sweden with a crew of young cadets both barreling toward each other at full speed, their captains locked in a deadly game of chicken. When the Stockholm's bow tore into the Andrea Doria's starboard side at 23 knots, the impact sounded like a bomb detonating inside the luxury liner's belly. But what made this collision unforgettable wasn't just the violence of metal rending metal. It was the 11-hour nightmare that followed as the Titanic of the modern era listed helplessly into the Atlantic, its fate sealed by a perfect storm of arrogance, technology, and sheer human error. Blame flew faster than the lifeboats could deploy. The Stockholm's crew insisted their radar showed the Andrea Doria veering into their path, while the Italian officers swore the Swedish ship had swung suddenly to port. Investigators later dissected the wreckage like a crime scene, uncovering a chilling truth. Both radars were working perfectly, the problem interpretation. The Stockholm's third officer, a 26-year-old with barely any sleep, misread the blips, assuming the Andrea Doria was miles farther away. Meanwhile, the Italian captain, trusting his own radar blindly, never slowed down despite the fog, a fatal miscalculation for a ship with a fatal design flaw. The Andrea Doria lacked proper bulkheads, meaning a single gaping hole could flood 7 decks. Passengers described the sinking with surreal horror. One moment they were dancing in the first-class lounge, the next chandeliers were swinging violently as the floor tilted 40 degrees. The ship's indoor pool emptied in a tidal wave, sweeping people down corridors. In the dining room, fine china slid off tables like miniature avalanches, shattering against walls now doubling as floors. Yet amid the chaos, the Andrea Doria's crew pulled off a miracle, evacuating over 1,600 people without a single passenger death, thanks to a fleet of nearby rescue ships. Lifeboats from the Stockholm, herself crippled but afloat, shuttled survivors through the fog as the Andrea Doria's band played ragtime tunes to calm the crowd, a bizarrely cheerful soundtrack to a ship's funeral. The final act was almost theatrical. As dawn broke, the liner rolled onto its side with a groan, its remaining lifeboats dragging uselessly in the water like discarded props. Then, just before 10 a.m., the Andrea Doria gave one last shudder and slipped beneath the waves, air bubbles bursting to the surface like a final, gasping breath. The wreck still rests 250 feet down, a monument to the dangers of overconfidence. Because here's the cruel irony, the collision happened in an era when ships were supposed to be unsinkable. Radar was the new marvel, the technology that would prevent another Titanic. Instead, it proved something darker, that the deadliest disasters often come not from ignorance but from the illusion of control. The Andrea Doria didn't just sink, it became a siren song for treasure hunters, luring divers to their deaths with the promise of first-class china and untold riches. Nicknamed the Mount Everest of scuba diving, this wreck wasn't just a grave for a ship, it became a graveyard for adventurers who underestimated its deadly allure. Resting 250 feet below the surface, the Doria's twisted wreckage is cloaked in near-total darkness, its corridors choked with silt and dangling cables. But the real danger isn't just the depth, it's the seductive pull of its treasures, scattered like breadcrumbs through a labyrinth of death. For decades, divers risked everything to retrieve the ship's famed cobalt blue china, each plate worth thousands to collectors. The first-class dining set, emblazoned with the Italia line's crest, became the ultimate trophy, a tangible piece of the ship's vanished glamour. But the Doria exacted a brutal toll. Descending to her wreck required technical diving skills far beyond recreational limits, with decompression stops so lengthy that a single miscalculation meant nitrogen narcosis or worse. One diver described the sensation as swimming through molasses, his vision narrowing to a tunnel as his brain fogged with depth-induced delirium. Others never resurfaced at all, their bodies lost in the wreck's pitch-black bowels. The most infamous tragedy struck in 1985 when veteran diver John Ormsby perished inside the ship's twisted ballroom. His last dive lights illuminated stacks of pristine china, then flickered out as his oxygen tank snagged on a railing, trapping him in the darkness. Rescue teams found his body days later, one hand still clutching a plate from the very set he died pursuing. Ormsby wasn't alone. By 2003, the wreck had claimed 16 lives, earning its grim reputation as the diver's widowmaker. Modern expeditions have only confirmed the Doria's lethal reputation. Shifting currents collapse entire sections of the hull without warning, burying artifacts and divers under tons of rusted steel. Yet the China still calls. In 2018, a team using robotic submersibles recovered a near-mint service set, their cameras capturing the eerie sight of tables still set for dinner, crystal glasses glinting in the sub's lights. But even technology can't tame the wreck's wrath. One bot got tangled in cables and imploded under pressure, a reminder that the Doria doesn't surrender her secrets, she takes them back. What makes this wreck so uniquely deadly isn't just the technical challenges, it's the psychological trap. Every diver who reaches the china believes they'll be the exception, the one who beats the odds. The Doria's lesson is crueler. Some treasures aren't meant to be found. They're meant to remind us that the ocean's greatest prize isn't what we take from it, but whether we're brave enough or foolish enough to try. The El Faro's final voyage wasn't just a tragedy. It was a slow-motion unraveling of human error, arrogance, and a storm that refused to be underestimated. On October 1, 2015, this 40-year-old cargo ship steamed straight into the heart of Hurricane Joaquin, a Category 4 monster churning with 150-mile-per-hour winds. What makes this disaster uniquely horrifying isn't the sinking itself, but the black box transcripts recovered from 3 miles underwater, a chilling audio diary of 33 lives marching toward doom, their captain clinging to weather reports as outdated as his sinking ship. Listen to those tapes and you'll hear the moment hope curdles into dread. Captain Michael Davidson, a seasoned mariner by all accounts, insists for hours that Joaquin is tracking north away from their route. Meanwhile, his crew watches the barometer plummet like a stone, the windscreen trembling under waves that dwarf the bridge. "We can't be this unlucky," Davidson mutters at one point, as if the ocean operates on chance rather than physics. The truth, his weather data was 20 hours old, pulled from an email attachment rather than real-time satellite feeds. While modern ships danced around Joaquin's edges, the El Faro charged ahead like a blindfolded bull into a hurricane. Then comes the mechanical betrayal. The ship's aging propulsion system, a relic held together by patches and prayers, fails just as Joaquin's eye wall closes in. The transcripts capture the engineer's panic as he reports seawater flooding the lube oil tanks, a death sentence for the engines. Without power, the El Faro turns sideways to 50-foot waves, each impact bending steel like tinfoil. Davidson's final words, captured at 12:47 p.m., aren't dramatic, just a resigned, "All right, I'm gonna call the bridge." 15 minutes later, the Coast Guard loses their beacon. The wreckage, found in pieces 15,000 feet down, tells the rest: scattered containers, a lifeboat still locked in its davits, never deployed. And the most damning clue, a survival suit zipped and ready, found floating alone miles from the wreck. Someone had tried, someone had known, but by then the ocean had already made its choice. The National Transportation Safety Board's report would later cite complacency as a factor, not just in Davidson's choices, but in the entire system that let a rusting ship sail into a hurricane with a weather app older than its crew. Yet the El Faro's legacy isn't just a cautionary tale, it's a mirror. In an era of GPS and instant updates, how does a captain end up navigating by yesterday's forecast? How does a billion-dollar shipping company ignore a decade of warnings about the ship's brittle hull and failing pumps? The transcripts don't just record a disaster, they document the moment technology outpaced human humility. Because hurricanes don't care about experience or tradition or the fact that you've sailed these waters for 30 years, they only care whether you respect them. And on October 1st, the El Faro forgot that lesson in the worst way possible. The SS Vestris was listing badly when she left New York on that November morning in 1928, tilting just enough to make passengers clutch at railings, but not enough to cancel the voyage. That was the first fatal mistake. The aging mail steamer, overloaded with cargo and carrying over 300 souls, had a known history of instability. Crew members later admitted they'd joked about her tendency to sail sideways, but no one expected her to capsize in broad daylight under clear skies. Yet that's exactly what happened, in a disaster so steeped in negligence and scandal that it forced maritime law to change, and exposed ugly truths about who gets saved first when the ocean turns violent. For 7 excruciating hours, the Vestris wallowed in the Atlantic, her list growing worse by the minute as frantic engineers battled flooding holds. Yet Captain William Carey refused to send a distress signal, convinced his ship would right itself. By the time he finally radioed for help, the Vestris was already on her side, lifeboats dangling uselessly from her tilted decks. Panic erupted as passengers, many immigrants in third class, realized there wouldn't be enough boats for everyone. Witness accounts from survivors describe crew members shoving women and children aside to save themselves, while first-class passengers allegedly bribed their way onto lifeboats with fistfuls of cash. One Italian family testified they were barred from a half-empty boat while wealthy travelers clambered aboard with suitcases still in hand. The racial undertones of the evacuation became impossible to ignore. Of the 110 who died, the vast majority were Black and Italian steerage passengers. White first-class survivors later claimed the crew prioritized women and children, but passenger manifests revealed a different story. Affluent men accounted for nearly half the rescued. Public outrage exploded when investigators discovered the Vestris's lifeboats had never been properly inspected, with rotted ropes and rusted pulleys that snapped under strain. Even the ship's life jackets, stored in locked cabinets, were inaccessible as the deck tilted to 45 degrees. The most damning revelation: the Vestris had been leaking for days before the voyage. A junior engineer's logbook recovered from the wreck noted chronic flooding in the cargo holds, a detail Captain Carey dismissed as normal for her age. When the ship finally slipped beneath the waves, she took with her any hope of justice. Carey, though stripped of his license, faced no criminal charges. The shipping company paid modest fines, blaming an act of God despite overwhelming evidence of human greed. But the Vestris's legacy isn't just a story of racism and cowardice. It's about how disaster magnifies existing inequalities. The same biases that dictated who slept in cramped bunks below decks also decided who got a spot in the lifeboats. In response, new regulations mandated lifeboat drills for all passengers and standardized safety inspections. Though it took another 60 years before maritime law fully addressed class discrimination in evacuations. The ocean may not care who drowns, but the Vestris proved humans very much do. And sometimes the deadliest part of a shipwreck isn't the water, it's the people deciding who deserves to escape it. The MV Derbyshire was a giant among ships, a behemoth stretching nearly 3 football fields long, built to haul iron ore across the roughest seas without flinching. But when this British titan vanished in the Pacific during Typhoon Orchid in 1980, it didn't just sink. It vanished without a single distress call, taking 44 lives with it. For years, the Derbyshire's fate was a gaping hole in maritime history, a puzzle so complex it took 2 decades and 3 separate investigations to unravel, and even then, the answers left room for chilling doubts. At first glance, the official explanation seems straightforward. The Derbyshire was hammered by waves taller than apartment buildings, their force crumpling the ship's massive hatch covers like soda cans. Water flooded the cargo holds, dragging the vessel down in minutes. Case closed, but dive deeper and the story fractures. Whistleblowers came forward, claiming the ship's hull had been riddled with stress cracks long before the typhoon flaws, ignored by inspectors under pressure to keep profits afloat. One former crew member described hearing metallic groans during routine voyages, sounds dismissed as normal for a ship of her size. Then there were the insurers who fought tooth and nail to avoid paying claims, insisting the Derbyshire's design was flawless. The wreck's discovery in 1994 only deepened the mystery. Lying 3 miles deep off Okinawa, the ship was fractured in 2, her bow and stern separated by half a mile of seabed. Forensic analysis revealed something even more unsettling. The cracks in her hull weren't just from the storm's fury. They traced back to weak points in the steel, areas where fatigue had crept in over years of heavy loads and rough seas. Typhoon Orchid might have been the final blow, but the Derbyshire had been a ticking time bomb long before the first raindrops fell. Conspiracy theories bloomed like oil slicks. Some pointed to classified cargo rumors swirled that the Derbyshire had been secretly carrying munitions, an explosion tearing her apart from within. Others blamed cost-cutting measures, accusing the ship's owners of skipping critical repairs. The most unsettling theory, that the Derbyshire's sinking was an open secret in the industry, a grim inevitability for a generation of ships pushed past their limits in the name of profit. What makes this disaster linger isn't just the lives lost, it's the shadow it cast over an entire industry. The Derbyshire's tragedy forced sweeping reforms in ship design, with double hulls and reinforced hatch covers becoming mandatory. But the whispers remain, because sometimes the scariest shipwrecks aren't the ones caused by nature's wrath, they're the ones where human negligence writes the script and the ocean just delivers the final act. The Derbyshire's wreck still lies in that crushing darkness, a monument to questions we'll never fully answer. And perhaps that's the most haunting lesson of all. In the deep, some truths don't float to the surface. They stay buried, waiting for the next storm to stir them up. The SS Poet set sail from Philadelphia on October 24, 1980, loaded with 13,000 tons of corn. At least that's what the manifest claimed. Bound for Egypt, this aging freighter and its crew of 34 should have been an unremarkable blip on the Atlantic's radar. Instead, it became one of the Bermuda Triangle's most stubborn enigmas, vanishing without so much as a mayday call. But the real mystery isn't just that the poet disappeared. It's that so many people seemed to know it would. Days before departure, crew members reported an unsettling atmosphere aboard the ship. The poet, already a rusting workhorse built during World War II, had undergone rushed slipshod repairs. One engineer later claimed the hull's patches were more paint than steel, while others whispered about last-minute cargo changes, unmarked crates loaded under cover of darkness. The captain, a taciturn veteran named Atwood, brushed off concerns, insisting the voyage would be routine, but his final radio check with the Coast Guard raised eyebrows. When asked about his route, Atwood hesitated, then gave coordinates that would take the poet dangerously close to the triangle's heart, a detour with no logical explanation. Then came the radio silence. Unlike other vanishings where static or garbled transmissions hinted at disaster, the poet's radio simply stopped, no distress signals, no engine failure reports, just dead air. By the time the Coast Guard launched a search, the ship was already 2 days overdue. What they found, or rather didn't find, defied logic. No lifeboats, no debris, not even an oil slick. The poet had dissolved into the Atlantic like smoke. The official inquiry blamed unknown forces, but conspiracy theorists pounced. Declassified documents later revealed the poet's owner had ties to shadowy arms dealers, fueling speculation that the grain ship was actually smuggling weapons to the Middle East. One former crewman swore he'd seen military-grade crates in the hold, their contents hastily covered with corn sacks. Could the poet have been sunk to cover up an illegal operation? The theory gained traction when a Spanish trawler reported an underwater explosion near the poet's last known position on the very night it vanished. Yet the ocean offers no easy answers. In 2015, a team hunting for Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 found a wreck they believed might be the poet. But the site, nearly 3 miles deep, proved too treacherous to explore. The poet's fate, like so many Bermuda Triangle victims, remains suspended between fact and folklore. Perhaps the truth lies in those unmarked crates, or perhaps the Atlantic simply claimed another ship, as it has for centuries, reminding us that some vanishings aren't puzzles to solve, but warnings to heed. The SS Henry Bacon wasn't just another Liberty ship churning through Arctic waters. It was a floating act of defiance in the dying days of World War II, a vessel that chose humanity over survival when the stakes couldn't have been higher. February 23, 1945. The Bacon, loaded with wounded soldiers and Norwegian refugees fleeing Nazi occupation, was the last Allied ship out of the Soviet port of Murmansk, running a gauntlet of German U-boats and blizzards so thick the deck ice had to be hacked away with axes. Then came the distress call. A convoy ahead had been ambushed. Standard procedure demanded full speed ahead to outrun the Wolfpack. But on the Bacon's deck stood 98 Norwegian civilians, half of them children, who'd survived years of Gestapo terror only to face freezing drownings if the ship took evasive maneuvers. Captain Alfred Carini made his choice in seconds: slow down, launch the lifeboats, and give these refugees a fighting chance, even if it meant painting a bullseye on his own ship. What happened next was equal parts tragedy and miracle. As the Bacon's crew lowered lifeboats into 12-foot swells, the storm ripped one apart instantly, spilling women and children into water so cold it induced cardiac arrest in minutes. Sailors dove in after them, tying survivors to ropes with numb hands as the ship's gunners kept up a desperate barrage against an unseen U-boat. Then impact. A torpedo tore into the Bacon's starboard side, flooding the engine room. The ship listed violently, yet the evacuation never stopped. One lifeboat, overcrowded with refugees, capsized 3 times before finally drifting away. Another vanished into the snow squall, its fate unknown for days. 19 souls perished that night, most frozen solid before rescue ships could reach them. But every single Norwegian refugee survived, plucked from the waves by crews who later described the scene as something out of Dante, but with children's mittens floating in the oil slick. The Bacon's final moments were straight from an epic poem. With power gone and the hull buckling, the remaining crew lashed themselves to the sinking deck to avoid being swept into the abyss, still firing machine guns at shadows in the blizzard. Their sacrifice bought just enough time. When the HMS Zambesi arrived hours later, they found lifeboats bobbing in the storm, their passengers singing Norwegian folk songs to keep from succumbing to hypothermia. The U-boat, it slipped away unseen, leaving no record of whether it ever knew the civilians it nearly murdered twice, first with Nazis, then with torpedoes. Decades later, declassified documents revealed an even crueler twist. The Bacon had been carrying secret radar jamming equipment, making it a high-value target. Had Carini ignored the refugees, he might have outrun the U-boat. Instead, he gave the Kriegsmarine their last Liberty ship kill of the war and gave 98 Norwegians their first taste of freedom. Today, a modest monument in Honningsvag honors the Bacon's crew, but the real memorial lives in the grandchildren of those refugees who still tell stories about the American sailors who chose to die slow so they could live. Because heroism isn't just about how you fight, sometimes it's about knowing when to stall. The SS Normandy was never meant to die on her knees, especially not in a New York dockyard with a gut full of smoke and shame. This French Art Deco masterpiece, once the pride of the Atlantic, had outrun Nazi U-boats only to meet her end at the hands of an overeager welder and a pile of life jackets. The year was 1942, and America, freshly at war, had seized the idle luxury liner to convert her into a troop ship renamed the USS Lafayette. But the ocean has a cruel sense of irony. The ship that had dodged torpedoes would succumb to something far more mundane, a spark. On February 9th, as dockworkers scrambled to strip the Normandy's lavish interiors, a welder's torch strayed too close to a stack of Kapok life vests. The material fluffy plant fibers sealed in canvas ignited like gunpowder. Within minutes, flames raced through the grand salon where celebrities and socialites had once sipped champagne under Lalique glass ceilings. Firefighters arrived to a surreal sight, the world's most advanced fire suppression system, installed during the ship's construction, rendered useless because the Navy had disconnected it during the rushed conversion. Crews could only watch as their high-pressure hoses pumped not just water into the burning hull, but disaster. Here's where physics took over with brutal efficiency. As the fire department flooded the upper decks, all that weight, thousands of tons of water collected on one side of the ship. The Normandy, designed to slice through North Atlantic swells, wasn't built to handle such imbalance while stationary. Slowly, agonizingly, she began to list. Dockworkers scrambled to cut ropes as the hull groaned against the pier, but it was too late. By morning, the Pride of France lay on her port side like a wounded animal, her funnels crushed against the pier, her elegant bow submerged in the Hudson's oily waters. The Navy's attempts to salvage the situation were almost as tragic as the fire itself. Investigators later learned that simple counter-flooding filling starboard tanks to offset the water weight could have saved the ship. But in the chaos, no one thought to try it. Instead, the military staged a bizarre PR stunt, refloating the Normandy only to scrap her in 1947. The official report blamed human error, but the truth was uglier. This wasn't just an accident, it was a parable about haste and hubris. The same nation that would build the atomic bomb in 3 years couldn't manage to keep a single ship upright in peacetime. What makes the Normandy's fate so haunting isn't the fire itself. It's the symbolism. Here was a vessel built to embody elegance and innovation, a floating rebuttal to the Great Depression's gloom, reduced to a cautionary tale about the cost of cutting corners. Even her final indignity felt poetic. As salvage crews picked her apart, they found her original christening plaque still gleaming beneath the soot. It bore the name she'd carried with pride until the world went mad: Normandy, a ghost of what happens when beauty meets brute necessity. The SS Arctic should have been a triumph of modern engineering, a gleaming transatlantic steamer that promised safety, speed, and luxury for its wealthy passengers. But on September 27, 1854, this pride of the Collins Line revealed the darkest truth about maritime disasters. When panic strikes, class and morality often sink faster than the ship. The Arctic's demise wasn't just a collision with fate. It was a mutiny of the soul, where crew members turned lifeboats into their personal escape pods while women and children screamed for mercy on the tilting deck. It started with fog, a thick, suffocating blanket that swallowed the Arctic whole as she neared Newfoundland. Out of that void emerged the French steamer Vesta, her iron bow slicing into the Arctic's starboard side like a knife through butter. At first, the damage seemed minor. Captain James Luce ordered inspections, reassured by crew reports of superficial scratches. But salt water was already gushing into the hold, and within an hour, the Arctic's fate became horrifyingly clear. With lifeboats for barely a third of the 600 souls aboard, Luce made the call that would haunt maritime history: women and children first. That's when the social contract shattered. Sailors ignored the captain's orders, piling into boats meant for passengers. Stewards shoved aside sobbing mothers to claim seats. Even the ship's carpenter, the man who'd built the lifeboats, abandoned his post to save himself. The most gut-wrenching betrayal: Luce's own officers, men sworn to protect passengers, commandeered the last functioning lifeboat, leaving their captain to watch helplessly as his wife and children clung to the railings. One survivor later recounted a crewman snarling, "Every man for himself now," as he rowed away from the sinking ship, his oars striking the hands of passengers who tried to claw their way aboard. The Arctic's final hours were a carnival of cowardice and heroism in equal measure. As the ship listed violently, a handful of men, mostly passengers, formed human chains to lower the remaining women and children onto makeshift rafts. One elderly gentleman gave his life jacket to a child before calmly sitting on the deck to await death. Meanwhile, the Vesta, despite her own damage, turned back to search for survivors. They found only 85, all men, nearly half of them crew members who'd fled in disgrace. Among the drowned were every child on board and Luce's entire family. The public outcry was volcanic. Newspapers branded the Arctic's crew sea-going murderers, while the Collins Line's reputation sank faster than the ship itself. Yet no one faced criminal charges. The surviving officers spun tales of uncontrollable panic, and maritime law at the time held no provisions for punishing abandonment of passengers. The Arctic's wreck still lies undiscovered, but its legacy is carved into modern safety regulations: lifeboat drills, mandatory passenger counts, and the unspoken rule that true sailors go down with the ship, or at least ensure others don't. Because the ocean doesn't just test a ship's hull, it tests the mettle of those who sail her. The SS Valentia wasn't just lost, it was taunted by salvation, its passengers close enough to see rescue yet doomed to die within arm's reach of dry land. On the night of January 22, 1906, this coastal steamer slammed into Vancouver Island's jagged cliffs. A place so notorious for shipwrecks, locals called it the graveyard of the Pacific. But what makes the Valentia's fate uniquely cruel isn't just the violence of the crash. It's the sickening spectacle that followed, where survivors clung to sea caves for days, watching helplessly as rescue crews fired rocket after rocket that fell pathetically short of their crumbling sanctuary. Imagine the scene. The Valentia, blinded by fog and storm winds, misjudged the entrance to the Strait of Juan de Fuca by just a few degrees. That small error sent the ship grinding against sheer rock walls, its hull peeling open like a tin can. Passengers awoke to a nightmare: the ship listing violently, lifeboats smashing against cliffs as they were lowered, the ocean swallowing women and children whole before they could even scream. Those who survived the initial impact found themselves trapped in a grotesque limbo. The ship's stern clung precariously to a rocky outcrop, creating a makeshift bridge to a sea cave, while the bow vanished into the frothing darkness. For hours, survivors huddled in that cavern, their flickering lanterns illuminating ancient indigenous petroglyphs on the walls, a bitter reminder that humans had stood here before, but never like this. Then came the rescuers. A life-saving crew arrived offshore, close enough for survivors to see their faces through the storm. They fired line-launching rockets, a technology designed to bridge such gaps, but the cliffs played a cruel trick. Every shot either fell short or overshot, the ropes tangling in the wind or snapping against the rocks. One survivor later described the sound of those failed rockets hitting the water, like a clock ticking down their remaining minutes alive. Desperation bred madness. A group of men tried to swim for help, only to be pulverized against the rocks. A young mother, clutching her baby, leapt toward a rescue sling and missed, vanishing into the surf. The cave itself became a death trap as rising tides forced survivors higher into its throat, where frigid water and exhaustion picked them off one by one. Even in death, the Valentia refused to surrender its victims. When salvage crews finally reached the wreck days later, they found ghastly evidence of the passengers' final moments, bodies huddled in frozen embrace, makeshift ropes woven from clothing still dangling from the cave's ceiling. But the most haunting discovery, a life raft washed ashore miles away, packed with skeletons. These were the lucky ones who'd escaped the cave, only to drift for days without food or fresh water, dying within sight of beaches they'd never reach. The Valentia's final toll, 136 souls lost, many within shouting distance of salvation. Today, the cliffs still bear scars from that night, rusty bolts from the ship's hull embedded in stone, a silent memorial to the cruelest of maritime truths. Sometimes the ocean doesn't kill you. It lets you watch as hope does the job instead. The SS Eastland never learned its lesson, not after drowning 844 people in the Chicago River, not after its owners dodged justice, and certainly not after being resurrected as a grim parody of its former self. By the 1930s, this floating tomb had been stripped of its cursed name, repainted, and reborn as the USS Wilmette, a Navy training vessel too stubborn to stay dead. But the ghosts of 1915 weren't done with her yet. Pearl Harbor, December 7, 1941. As Japanese Zeros screamed overhead, the Wilmette, now a hulking anti-aircraft platform, was moored just miles from Battleship Row. The irony was macabre. A ship that had once killed more passengers than any Great Lakes disaster was now tasked with defending others from annihilation. And then, as if the universe demanded poetic justice, the Wilmette's old demons resurfaced. Amid the chaos of the attack, the ship began listing ominously to port, its rusted hull groaning under the weight of panicked gunners and misfired ordnance. Sailors who knew nothing of the Eastland's past suddenly found themselves gripping railings as the deck tilted beneath them, a nightmare replaying in real time. The Navy's logs from that day tell a bizarre story. Unlike the other ships at Pearl, the Wilmette didn't take a single hit from Japanese bombers, yet eyewitnesses reported water surging into its lower decks just as it had 26 years earlier. Investigators later discovered the ship's hastily installed pumps, retrofitted for military use, had failed under pressure, allowing seawater to flood compartments that should have been sealed. Even in wartime, the Eastland's original sin, its fatal instability, refused to be scrubbed away. What makes this footnote in maritime history so chilling isn't just the coincidence. It's the pattern. The Eastland wasn't merely unlucky, it was a catastrophic lesson in cutting corners that kept being ignored. After the war, the Wilmette was decommissioned and sold for scrap. But the shipbreakers found something unsettling when they peeled back its steel skin. Patches of the original hull, still bearing stress fractures from the 1915 disaster, hastily welded over by Navy engineers. The ship had literally been papering over its flaws for decades. Today, the only remaining relic of the Eastland Wilmette is its bell, displayed at a museum in Michigan. But the real legacy isn't metal. It's the uncomfortable truth that some disasters aren't one-time events. They're cycles, because when profit outweighs safety, when shortcuts become standard, history doesn't just repeat itself. Sometimes it sinks twice. The MV Golden Ray wasn't just another cargo ship. It was a 656-foot-long game of Jenga gone horrifically wrong. A modern maritime disaster where every misstep turned a simple mistake into a 2-year, $800 million spectacle. Picture this: September 8, 2019, a calm dawn off the Georgia coast. The Golden Ray, a massive car carrier transporting over 4,000 brand new vehicles, makes a routine turn out of Brunswick Harbor. Then, without warning, the ship hesitates, shudders, and like a drunk giant slowly topples onto its side in water so shallow its starboard wing remains exposed to the sun. The initial cause seemed almost laughable, a miscalculation in ballast distribution, something sailors have been managing for centuries, but what followed was anything but routine. Inside the capsized hull, chaos erupted. Crew members scrambled through dark, tilting corridors as the ship's cargo luxury SUVs, pickup trucks, even electric vehicles broke free and slammed into bulkheads like out-of-control bumper cars. Rescue teams performed daring helicopter extractions, plucking sailors from the slanting deck as fuel oil seeped into the surrounding marshes, yet the real drama was just beginning. Unlike historical wrecks that sank unseen into the abyss, the Golden Ray's humiliation played out in high definition for the world. Drone footage captured its absurd predicament, a 20-story skyscraper of steel lying helplessly in the surf like a beached whale, its hull reflecting the flashing lights of emergency crews. Salvage operations became a billion-dollar circus. Engineers faced a nightmare scenario. How do you dismantle a 65,000-ton ship filled with toxic batteries, fuel, and thousands of crushed vehicles without triggering an environmental disaster? The answer was as audacious as it was terrifying. They built a custom, heavy-lift vessel, essentially a floating crab claw, to carve the Golden Ray into 8 pieces like a metallic cake. Each slice, weighing more than the Eiffel Tower, was then hoisted onto barges in a painstaking ballet of cranes and cables. The operation was so delicate that workers used thermal cameras to monitor for sparks, knowing one wrong move could ignite the volatile cocktail inside. But here's the twist: the salvage team's meticulous planning couldn't account for Georgia's notorious weather. Hurricanes, thunderstorms, even rogue waves, each delay added millions to the bill. At one point, a fire broke out inside the wreck, sending plumes of black smoke across vacation beaches. Locals joked darkly about their new tourist attraction, while environmentalists warned of a ticking time bomb for the nearby Okefenokee swamp. When the final section was finally removed in 2021, the seabed bore a ghostly imprint of the ship's outline, a scar that lingered long after the headlines faded. The Golden Ray's legacy isn't just a cautionary tale about ballast math. It's a snapshot of modern hubris where cutting-edge technology meets ancient human error. Today, the ship's remains are recycled into appliances and rebar, but its lesson floats on. In an age of drones and dollar signs, the ocean still writes its own rules. And sometimes it makes us pay $800 million just to learn them. The SS Princess Sophia wasn't supposed to die like this, not after surviving 40 agonizing hours stranded on a reef, her passengers singing hymns in the dark as rescue ships circled helplessly just out of reach. When this grand Alaskan steamer ran aground on Vanderbilt Reef in October 1918, the initial reports were almost optimistic. The ship sat firmly lodged on the rocks, her hull intact, her 353 passengers and crew warm and dry. The storm would pass, the tide would rise, and all would be well. But the North Pacific had other plans. At first, the scene aboard the Princess Sophia was eerily calm. The ship's captain, Leonard Locke, assured everyone that rescue was imminent. Passengers played cards in the saloon, children dozed in their bunks, and crew members brewed coffee to ward off the chill. Outside, the world dissolved into chaos. Gale-force winds churned the sea into a frothing maelstrom, tossing the lifeboats sent to save them like corks in a bathtub. The nearby lighthouse keeper, watching through his telescope, later described the horror of seeing rescue vessels like the Cedar and the King and Winge forced to retreat again and again, their hulls battered by waves taller than the Sophia's smokestack. By the second night, hope began to curdle into dread. The wind screamed through the rigging, and the ship, once so steady, started groaning as the tide lifted her just enough to grind against the reef. Below decks, seawater seeped into the holds, its oily fingers creeping higher with each passing hour. Passengers clustered in the dining saloon, their voices rising in ragged hymns to drown out the sound of the hull splitting. One woman scribbled a final letter to her sister. "The boat is rocking something terrible. I think we are lost." Then, at 4:30 in the morning on October 25th, the Sophia gave her final shudder. A monstrous wave wrenched her free from the reef's grip, and in moments the ship plunged bow first into the black water. Those still alive inside faced a nightmare beyond comprehension. Corridors became vertical shafts, staircases turned into waterfalls, and the sudden cold of the Alaskan sea punched the air from their lungs. The lighthouse keeper's log entry that morning was heartbreaking in its simplicity. Princess Sophia gone, no survivors. The aftermath was a grotesque spectacle of grief and futility. For weeks, bodies washed ashore still clad in life jackets, their frozen faces twisted in shock. One lifeboat was found wedged in a tree a mile inland, flung there by the storm's fury. The official inquiry blamed Captain Locke for navigating too close to the reef, but the truth was more complex. The Sophia's distress signals had been dismissed for hours by nearby ships, assuming she was safely anchored. Even her wireless operator, a hero who stayed at his post until the end, had been forced to improvise repairs to the radio with spare parts from a passenger's camera. What makes this disaster so haunting isn't just the scale of the loss, it's the crushing nearness of salvation. The Cedar had been close enough for passengers to see crew members' faces through binoculars. The tide needed to rise just 3 more feet to float the Sophia free, but the North Pacific doesn't bargain. It doesn't compromise, and on that October night, it made sure the Princess Sophia took every soul with her, leaving only oil slicks and unanswered questions swirling in her wake. Today, the reef still bears scars from that night, flecks of red paint embedded in the rock, a silent testament to the ship that almost escaped. And in Juneau's waterfront cemetery, 353 unmarked graves stand in rows, their headstones all bearing the same date. The Titanic of the West, they called her afterward, but the Sophia's real epitaph is far simpler. So close, so terribly close. The SS Atlantis wasn't built to last, it was built to prove a point. In the desperate scramble of World War I, steel was in such short supply that someone had a truly bizarre idea. What if ships could be made of concrete? Not just reinforced with it, but entirely poured from the stuff like floating sidewalks. The Atlantis was one of 12 experimental cement vessels commissioned by the U.S. government, a hulking gray oddity that looked less like a ship and more like a misplaced industrial warehouse. And for a brief, bizarre moment, it worked. After the war, the Atlantis found new life as a floating advertisement off the coast of Cape May, New Jersey. A local entrepreneur bought the ship for a song, painted it bright yellow, and turned it into a billboard for his ferry service. Tourists would row out to touch its weird, gritty hull, kids posed for photos on its deck, and for a few summers it became the Atlantic's quirkiest landmark. But concrete, as it turns out, doesn't age gracefully in salt water. By 1926, the Atlantis was a crumbling ghost of itself, its hull riddled with cracks that groaned louder with each passing storm. Then came the nor'easter. On June 8th, the ship's moorings snapped like twigs, and the Atlantis, all 7,000 tons of it, drifted helplessly toward the shore. Rescue crews could only watch as the waves pounded it onto a sandbar, rolling the massive vessel onto its side like a dying whale. For weeks, it lay half-submerged, a surreal spectacle drawing crowds of gawkers. One local newspaper described it as a modern Atlantis, its exposed ribs of rebar rusting in the sun. The final insult, the Atlantis refused to sink completely. Even as tides gnawed at its structure, chunks of concrete breaking off like icebergs, the wreck remained stubbornly visible at low tide for decades. Dive teams reported eerie encounters with its skeletal remains, where fish darted through gaping holes that once held engines. Today, all that's left is a few stubs of pilings barely visible at low tide, a monument to one of maritime history's most baffling experiments. Because sometimes the ocean doesn't just reject our ideas. It grinds them into sand. The SS Pendleton didn't just break apart, it cracked open like an egg, spilling men into the frigid maw of a New England nor'easter with nothing but faith and a prayer between them and oblivion. February 18, 1952, the Pendleton, a 500-foot T2 tanker hauling kerosene and heating oil, was already a relic of World War II, her steel fatigued from years of hard use. When the storm hit, it didn't just test the ship, it exposed a fatal flaw hidden in her very bones. The Pendleton snapped clean in two near Cape Cod, her bow and stern sections drifting apart like estranged lovers in the howling dark. But what makes this disaster unforgettable isn't just the violence of the split, it's the near-impossible rescue that followed. A feat of courage so audacious Hollywood would later call it the finest hours. Inside the severed stern section, 33 crewmen clung to whatever they could as the ship listed wildly. With no power, no radio, and the forward half of their vessel already swallowed by the Atlantic, their situation seemed hopeless. The storm raged with 50-foot waves and 70-knot winds, conditions no sane sailor would venture into. Enter boatswain's mate first-class Bernard Webber and his three-man Coast Guard crew, crammed into a 36-foot wooden lifeboat not much bigger than a fishing skiff. Their mission: find the Pendleton's stern in pitch darkness with nothing but a handheld compass and sheer guts to guide them. What happened next defied all odds. Webber's tiny boat, the CG 36,500, was battered so violently that its windshield shattered, the compass washed overboard, and the crew resorted to bailing with their boots. Yet somehow, through a combination of instinct and desperation, they located the Pendleton's hulking stern section, now vertical in the water, its screws exposed to the sky like a grotesque sculpture. Waves crashed over the tanker's deck, threatening to crush the lifeboat against the steel hull with every surge. But Webber held position long enough for survivors to leap, one by one, into his boat, their hands so numb with cold they couldn't even grip the ropes. The real miracle: space. The CG 36,500 was built for 12, maybe 15 in a pinch. Yet Webber crammed 32 Pendleton crewmen aboard, stacking them like firewood in waist-deep freezing water. One survivor later described the scene as a can of sardines with hypothermia. The return trip through breaking waves should have been suicidal, but the little boat somehow stayed afloat, its bilge pumps working overtime as men vomited seawater and prayed. When they finally reached Chatham Harbor, the lifeboat was so overloaded its gunwales barely cleared the waterline. While the bow section's crew perished to a man, the stern's survival became legend. Engineers later discovered the Pendleton's fatal weakness: hairline cracks in the T2 tanker's welded hulls, a design flaw that had already doomed dozens of ships. But the real story here isn't the failure of steel, it's the triumph of will. Webber and his crew received the gold life-saving medal, yet they always insisted they'd just been doing their job. That job, as it turned out, redefined the limits of small boat rescues forever, and the CG 36,500. It's preserved today at the Cape Cod Coast Guard Museum, a humble wooden relic that dared to stare down the Atlantic and won. What lingers isn't just the heroism, but the chilling randomness of fate. The Pendleton's bow vanished without a trace, taking 8 men with it, while the stern became the stage for one of history's greatest rescues. Same storm, same ship, 2 wildly different endings. Perhaps that's the ocean's cruelest lesson. Survival isn't just about skill or courage. Sometimes it's about which half of the ship you're standing on when the steel snaps. The SS Montevideo Maru sailed under a shroud of deception, its true cargo hidden even from the crew navigating its decks. By July 1, 1942, this unmarked Japanese transport ship had become a floating war crime, stuffed with over 1,000 Australian and Allied prisoners, men who'd survived the fall of Rabaul only to board a vessel worse than any prison camp. What none of them knew was that their captors had deliberately left the ship's hull bare of the red cross markings required for POW transports, turning them into invisible targets in a deadly game of maritime roulette. Silence was the first weapon used against these prisoners. The Japanese crew forbade shouting, singing, or even coughing too loudly as the ship crept through the South China Sea, terrified an Allied submarine might hear. Men packed into the sweltering holds like sardines, their only water rationed in thimblefuls, developed dysentery so severe the floors became slick with waste. Some prisoners scratched tallies into the bulkheads, counting each suffocating day. Others played mental chess, trying not to dwell on the rumors of hell ships that never reached their destinations. Then came the torpedoes. At 2:29 in the morning on July 1st, the American submarine USS Sturgeon spotted the Montevideo Maru's silhouette through its periscope. Commander William Wright had no reason to suspect the unmarked freighter carried Allied lives. Japanese merchantmen regularly smuggled troops and supplies under false flags. Two torpedoes streaked through the black water. The first missed. The second struck amidships with a muffled thud that prisoners below decks initially mistook for a depth charge. Chaos erupted as seawater gushed into the holds. Japanese guards bolted the hatches shut from the outside, trapping men in rising darkness. A few resourceful POWs used belt buckles to pick the locks, only to find the corridors already waist-deep in swirling brine. Those who made it topside faced a new horror. The Japanese crew had prioritized their own survival, abandoning the lifeboats without unshackling a single prisoner. As the ship listed violently, hundreds tumbled into the water, only to watch the few available lifeboats row away without them. The sinking lasted just 11 minutes. By dawn, the ocean had swallowed every trace of the Montevideo Maru and 1,053 souls. The Sturgeon's crew celebrated another successful kill, unaware they just inflicted Australia's deadliest maritime tragedy. When the truth surfaced years later, it revealed a double betrayal, by Japan for its criminal negligence and by the fog of war itself, which turned allies into accidental executioners. Today, the wreck lies undiscovered in 1,300 feet of water, its location a mystery as deep as the moral questions it raises. Memorials across Australia bear the names of those lost, but the real epitaph is written in the silence of submarine archives. A single radio log from the Sturgeon that reads simply, "Sank one large freighter." No cheers, no regrets, just war. The SS Morro Castle didn't just leave behind charred wreckage and unanswered questions. It unleashed a trail of cursed artifacts that seemed to carry the disaster's lingering malice into the hands of those who claimed them. Take the ship's bell, salvaged from the ashes and sold to a wealthy collector in the 1930s. By 1942, it was gathering dust in the basement of a notorious New Jersey mobster who swore the thing rang on its own every September 7th, the anniversary of the fire, even when encased in glass. His thugs refused to go near it, claiming the sound wasn't metallic but human, like distant screams muffled by water. When the FBI raided the home in '51, agents found the bell wrapped in a priest stole, its clapper removed. The mobster's diary entry from that final week read, "It's not a bell, it's an echo." Then there's the piano from the first-class lounge, recovered relatively intact and sold to a Brooklyn music school. Teachers reported keys playing themselves at night, their notes discordant and frantic. A janitor quit after witnessing the lid slam shut on invisible hands, while students complained of a hot smell near the bench. The final straw came when a prodigy performing Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue, a piece played aboard the Morro Castle the night of the fire, suddenly froze mid-song, her hands blistering as if scalded. The piano vanished into a private collector's warehouse, its current location unknown. But the most chilling artifact wasn't an object, it was a survivor's mind. Able seaman Daniel Campbell, who'd escaped the Inferno by jumping from the tilting deck, suffered night terrors so vivid they blurred reality. For decades, he woke at 2:15 a.m., the exact moment the fire began, to the sound of tearing metal and a phantom heat that left his sheets soaked with sweat. Psychiatrists dismissed it as PTSD until 1963, when Campbell's landlady found him dead in his bathtub, drowned in 2 inches of water, his skin covered in blisters matching Morro Castle victim burn patterns. The coroner ruled it a seizure, but the fire department's report noted an inexplicable detail. The bathroom mirror had shattered from heat stress, its glass fused into odd, finger-like strands. Even inanimate objects seemed tainted. A life preserver salvaged by a Florida fisherman became a macabre tourist attraction until guests reported hearing whispers emanating from its cork, not in English, but in the panicked mix of languages spoken by passengers that night. A child's doll, found floating miles from the wreck, blinked its glass eyes for no discernible reason when placed on display at a maritime museum. Staff eventually locked it in storage after visitors complained of smelling smoke near its case. What binds these stories isn't just superstition, it's the unsettling pattern of contact. Whether psychological or paranormal, those who interacted with Morro Castle relics experienced the disaster not as history but as something alive. Perhaps that's the true curse of maritime tragedies. They don't fade. They seep into the world through objects, dreams, and inexplicable moments that defy logic. And sometimes the ocean doesn't just claim ships, it imprints them. The SS United States wasn't just fast, it was a bullet slicing through the Atlantic, a ship so quick it stole the Blue Rib and from the Queen Mary in 1952 and held the record for speed until the age of jets made ocean liners obsolete. Built as a Cold War masterpiece with dual-purpose engineering capable of converting to a troopship in days, this sleek red, white, and blue icon symbolized American ingenuity. But today, gutted and decaying in a Philadelphia shipyard, its hull isn't just a relic. It's a time capsule of toxic secrets, wrapped in enough asbestos to turn preservation into a public health nightmare. Beneath that peeling paint lies the cruel irony of the United States design. The ship's blistering speed she crossed the Atlantic in 3 days and 10 hours was partly thanks to lightweight asbestos insulation, which prevented fires while shaving off critical weight. Back then, the magic mineral was hailed as a miracle. Now, it's the reason this national treasure can't be saved. Conservators estimate the ship contains over 500 tons of the carcinogen, woven into every bulkhead and pipe. Removing it wouldn't just cost hundreds of millions, it would require dismantling the ship piece by piece, effectively destroying the very artifact they hope to preserve. The debate over the United States' fate pits nostalgia against pragmatism. On one side, groups like the SS United States Conservancy argue the ship could become a dynamic museum, a monument to mid-century design and maritime history. Early proposals included floating hotels, event spaces, even a casino. But funding evaporates when developers hear the word asbestos. Meanwhile, scrap dealers circle like vultures, eager to recycle the aluminum superstructure, once the largest single use of the metal in any ship, into soda cans and airplane parts. Some survivors of the ship's glory days still fight for her. Former passengers recall the United States' elegance, the modernist chandeliers that couldn't swing even in rough seas thanks to her stabilizers, the secret military-grade engines that remain classified to this day, even the no-wood policy that eliminated fire hazards but gave interiors a stark, utilitarian beauty. One stewardess remembers serving martinis to Duke Ellington in the first-class lounge as the ship sliced through waves at 44 miles per hour, faster than many cars on the Eisenhower-era highways visible from the deck. Yet the ship's most haunting quality isn't its past, it's its limbo. Unlike the Queen Mary, preserved in Long Beach, or the SS Rotterdam, transformed into a boutique hotel, the United States lingers in purgatory. Rust streaks her funnels like tears, pigeons nest in the hollowed-out bridge, and every hurricane season, activists hold their breath, wondering if nature will finish what bureaucracy started. The bitterest twist, the asbestos that made her a marvel now makes her a pariah. Because sometimes progress doesn't just retire the past, it leaves it poisonously untouchable, floating just beyond reach of salvation. The SS Leviathan wasn't just a ship, It was a Trojan horse floating under the stars and stripes, a German-built colossus snatched by the US during World War I and rebranded as an American troop carrier. But beneath its fresh coat of paint and patriotic bunting, the vessel hid a labyrinth of secrets, its steel bones still whispering loyalties to the Kaiser. When inspectors finally peeled back its layers in 1917, they uncovered a maritime nightmare, hidden compartments stuffed with enough explosives to turn the ship into a floating bomb, rigged to detonate at the heart of Allied operations. This wasn't just espionage, it was sabotage on an industrial scale. The Leviathan, originally christened the Vaterland, had been designed with stealth warfare in mind. False walls in the cargo holds concealed caches of dynamite, while plumbing systems hid fuses disguised as innocent pipes. Crew members reported strange echoes in the corridors, metallic clicks behind bulkheads later revealed to be the sound of timed incendiary devices tucked between the ship's ribs. The most chilling discovery, a sealed chamber near the engine room, its lock smeared with grease to muffle the telltale screech of its hinges. Inside, investigators found detailed maps of New York Harbor with depth markings, as if someone had planned to scuttle the Leviathan at the perfect moment to blockade the port. But who orchestrated this floating death trap? Suspicion fell on the ship's original German engineers, who'd allegedly embedded sabotage protocols into the Leviathan's very blueprints. One deckhand testified that before the US seizure, he'd seen men in civilian clothes, presumably German agents, inspecting the vessel's structural weaknesses with unusual intensity. The plot thickened when naval intelligence intercepted coded messages referencing the sleeping giant, a phrase some analysts believe pointed to the Leviathan's dormant destructive potential. The US Navy's response was equal parts brilliance and paranoia. Every inch of the ship was scrubbed, scanned, and rebuilt, not just to remove explosives, but to reverse engineer the sabotage techniques for America's own use. The Leviathan's survival became a propaganda coup, its transformation from German wolf to Allied workhorse touted as proof of Yankee ingenuity, but the psychological damage lingered. For the rest of the war, crew members eyed every unexplained noise or flickering light with suspicion, never quite sure if they'd found all the surprises hidden in the ship's steel veins. What makes the Leviathan story resonate today isn't just the audacity of the plot, it's the uncomfortable truth it reveals about trust in wartime. The ship's very existence blurred the line between vessel and weapon, passenger and pawn. And in an era of modern naval warfare where cyberattacks can hijack a ship's systems remotely, the Leviathan stands as a grim reminder. Sometimes the deadliest threats don't come from outside the hull. They're built into it. The SS Savannah was meant to herald a new era, a gleaming hybrid of sail and steam that would conquer the Atlantic with the audacity of innovation. But from the moment its paddle wheels first churned the waters in 1819, this so-called marvel seemed to carry a shadow. Sailors whispered that no vessel should harness fire and wind together, that pitting boiler against breeze was an affront to the ocean itself. And as the Savannah's financial dreams crumbled faster than its soot-choked engines, even the most rational minds began to wonder, had the old superstitions been right all along? Crew members were the first to voice their dread. They called her a fire canoe, a cursed contraption that belched black smoke into the faces of the gods. Traditional sailing ships moved with the grace of the wind's will, but the Savannah forced her way forward with mechanical arrogance, her pistons pounding like an unnatural heartbeat. At night, stokers claimed to hear voices in the steam hiss words in no language they recognized. One engineer swore he saw shapes moving in the coal bunker, shadows that vanished when he reached for his lantern. The ship's few passengers reported nightmares of drowning while burning alive, as if the ocean and flame were warring for their souls. Then came the financial disasters. The Savannah's maiden transatlantic voyage, intended to dazzle investors, became a parade of humiliations. port officials in Europe refused to believe a steam-powered ship could cross the ocean, dismissing her as a hoax. Crowds gathered not to admire her, but to mock the sooty, rattling spectacle. Potential buyers balked at her exorbitant operating costs. Why pay for coal when the wind was free? Even President James Monroe's endorsement couldn't salvage her reputation. By 1821, just 2 years after her launch, the Savannah was stripped of her engines and reduced to a common sailing packet, her innovative heart ripped out and sold for scrap. But here's where the legend deepens. The men who'd worked her boilers met fates too grim to ignore. The chief engineer vanished during a routine coastal run. His body never recovered. 2 stokers died in separate accidents, one crushed by a runaway piston, another scalded when a seam burst. The ship's final captain went bankrupt, then mad, insisting in his last incoherent letters that the sea would claim every fire-kissed plank. Meanwhile, the Savannah herself, demasted and rotting, foundered off Long Island in 1821, taking none of her secrets to the sandy bottom. Modern historians blame poor marketing and outdated technology for the Savannah's failure. But maritime folklore tells a darker tale of a ship that dared too much too soon in a world still ruled by wind and wave. Perhaps the curse wasn't in the engines themselves, but in humanity's hubris, thinking the ocean would surrender its mysteries to a few pounds of steam pressure. The Savannah didn't just sink, she was swallowed, as if the sea itself had finally put the fire canoe in its place. The SS Californian wasn't just near the Titanic when it sank, it was close enough to see its distress rockets explode in the frigid night sky. Yet for over a century, historians have wrestled with a single, damning question. Why did this ship, positioned a mere 10 to 20 miles away, fail to come to the rescue? The official inquiries painted the Californian's crew as tragically oblivious, its wireless operator asleep and its captain unaware of the unfolding catastrophe. But newly uncovered documents suggest something far more sinister, a web of negligence, ambition, and a captain whose career after the disaster reads like a blueprint for avoiding accountability. Captain Stanley Lord's actions, or lack thereof, on the night of April 14, 1912, have been dissected for generations. Watch officers claimed they reported seeing white rockets to Lord, who dismissed them as company signals from another vessel. Yet maritime law was unequivocal. Rockets at sea meant distress, full stop. Lord's insistence that he ordered the Californian's engines warmed up, but never actually moved the ship, smacks of calculated hesitation. Even more telling, the ship's log from that night mysteriously disappeared, while the crew's testimony at the British inquiry shifted under pressure, with key witnesses suddenly forgetting critical details. But the real smoking gun lies in Lord's post-Titanic career. Branded a pariah by the shipping industry, he didn't fade into obscurity. Instead, he resurfaced under aliases, captaining tramp steamers under flags of convenience where oversight was lax. Court records from Buenos Aires in 1923 reveal a striking case. A ship under the command of a Stanley Lawson, a known Lord pseudonym, was fined for ignoring distress flares from a foundering freighter. The defense, the same excuse Lord used for the Titanic, he thought they were celebratory. By the 1930s, Lord was running opium shipments along the Chinese coast, his vessels routinely cited for safety violations. This wasn't just a man prone to bad judgment, it was a pattern of willful disregard for life at sea. Modern sonar scans of the Titanic's debris field add another chilling layer. Analysis of the rocket's trajectories suggests they would have been visible from the Californian's position for nearly an hour, plenty of time to intervene. Researchers now believe the ship's crew may have even seen the Titanic's lights vanish as it sank, yet still did nothing. The most damning theory, Lord, obsessed with maintaining his schedule and avoiding ice damage to his own vessel, prioritized profit over humanity. The Californian's legacy isn't just about failure, it's about the cost of indifference. While the Titanic's band played on, Lord's inaction sentenced hundreds to icy deaths. And in the shadow of his later crimes, one thing becomes clear: some captains don't just make mistakes, they make choices. The SS Great Eastern wasn't just a ship, it was an ironclad curse, a leviathan so far ahead of its time that the ocean itself seemed determined to punish its audacity. When Isambard Kingdom Brunel unveiled his masterpiece in 1858, it dwarfed every vessel afloat, stretching nearly 700 feet, longer than even the Titanic would be half a century later. Its revolutionary double hull, massive paddle wheels, and screw propeller made it a mechanical marvel, but from the moment it slid into the Thames, disaster clung to its iron plates like barnacles. Take its very launch, a spectacle so disastrous it felt like an omen. As the Great Eastern eased into the water, a malfunction sent the massive hull grinding sideways, crushing a worker to death and injuring dozens. Spectators fled as timber supports exploded like matchsticks, and Brunel himself, already weakened by illness, collapsed on the docks. The press dubbed it Brunel's folly, but the real horrors were just beginning. The ship's maiden voyage was a grotesque parade of misfortune. A boiler explosion ripped through the engine room, killing 5 stokers and scalding several others. Survivors described the sound as a thunderclap inside a cathedral, followed by screams muffled under jets of superheated steam. Then came the mutiny. Crew members, convinced the ship was hexed, refused to sail further, forcing the captain to dock in Ireland with half the passengers demanding refunds. Even the Great Eastern state-of-the-art communications system, a prototype of the transatlantic telegraph cable, failed spectacularly, leaving the ship adrift in silence for days. Yet the darkest legend surrounds its construction. Workers swore they'd sealed a man inside the double hull, a riveter accidentally trapped between the layers, his frantic hammering heard for days before fading into silence. Whether myth or macabre truth, the tale clung to the ship, with passengers reporting ghostly knocks from deep within the bulkheads during crossings. Brunel, ever the rationalist, dismissed such stories as superstition, but even he couldn't ignore the Great Eastern's uncanny ability to attract tragedy. By the 1860s, the cursed ship had found new purpose as a cable layer, its vast holds perfect for spools of transatlantic telegraph wire. Here, at last, it achieved something like redemption until a hurricane snapped its precious cable mid-lay, costing investors millions. The final insult came when the Great Eastern was reduced to a floating carnival in Liverpool, its grand saloons repurposed as makeshift theaters and its decks lined with carnival games. Visitors tossed coins into its rusting funnels for luck, unaware they were mocking the corpse of Brunel's dream. When scrappers finally tore the iron monster apart in 1888, they uncovered something chilling. Lodged between the inner and outer hulls was a skeleton, still clutching a rusted rivet gun. The Great Eastern hadn't just been a ship, it had been a floating coffin carrying its original sin across the Atlantic for 30 years. Brunel's genius had built a titan, but the ocean, as always, had the last word. The wreckers sold its iron as scrap, but the real legacy lingered, proof that some ships aren't merely doomed, they're born that way. What ties these tragedies together isn't just bad luck or rogue waves, it's the collision of human flaws with nature's indifference. Time and again, we see the same lethal mix: arrogance cutting corners, greed overriding safety, and technology tricking us into thinking we've tamed the sea. The Eastland's rotten life jackets, the Morro castle's ignored fire hazards, the El Faro's outdated weather reports, these weren't unforeseeable disasters. They were choices, but the ocean doesn't negotiate. It doesn't care about profit margins or tight schedules. The Edmund Fitzgerald didn't sink because Lake Superior was angry. It sank because metal fatigues, cargo shifts, and storms don't forgive design flaws. The SS Arctic's crew didn't drown because the fog was malicious. They died because panic erases morality faster than a wave washes away footprints. Yet there's a haunting beauty in these wrecks. They're cautionary tales written in steel and salt water, reminding us that progress means nothing without humility. Every lifeboat left behind, every ignored warning whistle, every unsinkable boast, they all whisper the same truth: the sea isn't our enemy. Our own hubris is. So tell us, which of these stories rattled you the most? Was it the Mary Celeste's ghostly abandonment, the General Slocum's burning children, or the SS Valentia's cruel near rescue? Drop your pick in the comments, and if you crave more deep dives into history's forgotten shadows, hit subscribe, because the ocean keeps its secrets but will never stop dredging them